The worst day of Queen Victoria's life came on the 14th of December 1861 with the death of Prince Albert, her beloved husband. In today's video from History Calling, we look not just at the final illness, tragic death and burial of the Prince Consort, but at the extreme effect it had on his wife and the bizarre behaviour she engaged in over the next 40 years as she struggled to hold on to him. This is the tale of how one of the greatest love stories in royal history came to a tragic end, and of how Victoria simply couldn't let go. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was born on the 26th of August 1819. Here at Schloss Rosenau near Coburg in Germany. He was the son of Duke Ernst of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha and Louise of Saxe-Gotha-Altenburg. Through his paternal aunt, Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, he was the first cousin of her daughter, a little British princess also called Victoria, who had been born 3 months earlier and who would, within 6 months of Albert's birth, once her father had died, become the heiress presumptive to the throne of her uncle, William IV. In 1837, this 18-year-old girl duly became queen, and having met and fallen in love with her handsome cousin Albert while he was visiting England, she proposed to him, as was the protocol as she outranked him. They were married on the 10th of February 1840, and Albert was eventually given the title of Prince Consort in 1857. Victoria became pregnant right away, and between 1840 and 1857 she would give birth to 9 children. Though her marriage to Albert certainly had its stormy moments, the pair were devoted to one another, and as it would turn out, Victoria's devotion crossed the line into obsession. The couple's second child, but oldest son, and therefore the heir to the throne, was Prince Bertie, named after his father, and better known to history by the name he eventually adopted upon taking the throne, Edward VII. Born on the 9th of November 1841, Bertie did not get along well with his parents, who considered him lazy, stupid, and dull. Things only got worse as he grew up. In 1861, he was sent to Ireland to gain military experience and was based at the Curragh military camp near Dublin. There, he met an Irish actress named Nellie Clifton, with whom he struck up a relationship, which continued even after he returned to England. When Victoria and Albert got wind of it, they were utterly appalled, and on the 25th of November, the Prince Consort, despite already being under the weather and suffering from insomnia, went to Cambridge, where his son was studying, to have the matter out with him. The two went for a walk in the cold and wet, and Albert caught a chill. He returned to Windsor Castle on the 26th, and within a few days he told his eldest daughter, Princess Vicky, that he was at a very low ebb, having barely slept for a fortnight and contracted a very heavy catarrh, and for the past 4 days am suffering from headache and pains in my limbs which may develop into rheumatism. At Windsor he continued to deteriorate. Though having always been a workaholic, he wouldn't stop and rest, even when it was so clear that he needed it. Instead, on the 28th of November, he was dealing with an international incident between Britain and the United States as a result of an American warship stopping a British steamer and seizing 2 Confederate envoys who were on board it. For context, this was at the beginning of the American Civil War. He wrote a draft of advice for Victoria relating to this incident and told her when he brought it to her that I could hardly hold my pen. His wife's diaries provide a blow-by-blow account of his steady decline over the next 2.5 weeks. At first, she thought he was a little better after a hot bath on the night of the 28th, but the next day he struggled to watch a parade of 200 boys from Eton School, which is very close to Windsor, and could hardly walk. On the 30th of November, she noted that dearest Albert slept badly and felt weak and poorly, but he came to breakfast. He was hardly eating though, although he managed some dinner. By the 1st of December he looked very wretched, and Victoria was quite concerned about him. Nevertheless, he went to chapel, which I assume is St. George's Chapel at Windsor, and put himself through, quote, all the kneeling, though the Queen thought he really wasn't up to it. He even drafted a letter Victoria was to write to Lord Russell. Over the next few days, he ate less and suffered from chills, a continued lack of sleep, and depression. The doctor, Jenner, came on the night of the 1st into the 2nd, and Albert was only able to lie on his sofa in his rooms and be read to by Victoria. As she watched him, she went through an emotional roller coaster, sometimes hoping he seemed better, only for those hopes to be dashed. He was barely eating or sleeping, and on the whole looked worse every day. At this stage, his doctors still had hope, though. On the 3rd of December, Victoria wrote that good, kind old Sir J. Clark has been here since yesterday and reassured me, saying there was no cause for alarm, either present or future. It looked as if it were likely to turn into a low fever, but he felt sure Albert would soon be better. His patient had no such hopes, and seems to have accepted death was coming for him early on. Always a bit of a hypochondriac and prone to melancholy thoughts, he told the Queen on the 2nd of December it was well that he had no fever, as he felt he should not recover from it. We all told him this was foolish, and he must never speak of such a thing. He was still able to get up and move around, but on the 4th of December could take no nourishment, only sip a little raspberry vinegar in seltzer water. The next day, Victoria reported, Dear Albert very restless, haggard and suffering, though at times he seemed better. It is terrible, these ups and downs of hope and fear. The doctors do not seem alarmed, but Dr. Jenner said he must eat, and that he was going to tell him so, that completely starving himself, as he had been doing, could not go on. When he did eat, though, for he had some broth that night, he, quote, complained sadly of discomfort. This state of affairs continued for some days. Sometimes he ate and slept a little, and Victoria and the doctors had hope that he was decidedly better. At other times he was in a wretched condition, weak and excitable, quite unlike himself. The Queen was now in a constant state of anxiety, as she wrote, but there was nothing she could do but sit with him, talking or reading to him, as their daughter Princess Alice did too. A visit from 4-year-old Princess Beatrice on the 6th raised his spirits temporarily, for he quite laughed at some of her new French verses. But these little rallies never lasted. The very next morning he was up and sitting in his sitting room, looking very weak and exhausted and not better, complaining of there being no improvement and that he could not make out why this was. He seemed to me, Victoria, a little incoherent. That very day the doctors found a rash on his stomach and decided his condition was, quote, gastric and bowel fever. They felt it would take a month for it to run its course, and dated the first day of the illness to the 22nd of November, perhaps even earlier. They decided not to tell the prince of his diagnosis, quote, as he had a horror of fever, and the younger children were to be kept away from him. Victoria tried to cheer herself with the thought that many people survived such fevers. She and the doctors agreed the cause was worry, of which dear Albert had had much of late, and too hard work. On the 8th of December his tongue was very furred, and he was incredibly thirsty. He could still talk, though, and asked to be moved from his room to the blue room, where the sun would shine in more effectively. He asked for music, too, and when a piano had been brought into the adjacent room, Princess Alice played for him. On the 9th there was another rally. Albert had slept well and seemed much more himself. When he took his broth, he quite sat up as usual, and shows great strength, but is now entirely in bed. Delirium was increasingly a problem, though. It was there on the night of the 9th, and on the 10th Victoria reported that he was still frequently wandering in his mind, but this, Sir James said, was to be expected. Nevertheless, the doctors had considerable hope, and so did the royal family. He was up on his sofa on the 11th, still able to take some breakfast. By the 12th, though, there were concerns about his breathing, though the doctors tried to brush these off. Victoria described his condition as follows. He was rather excited and confused, but Dr. Jenner said it was all due to the fever and generally occurred in such cases. We rejoiced to think that tomorrow would be the 22nd day, and that in another week, please God, he would be getting over the period of convalescence, though I hardly dare do so except with fear and trembling. Dear Albert has been moved into a small new bed, which they thought would be better for him. Saw Dr. Jenner and Dr. J. Clark, who had returned, and thought all was going well. The quickness of breathing gave no cause for any present alarm. Albert had held his ground. Personally, I don't think Albert was holding his ground, as the continued delirium and breathing problems were a deterioration in his condition. That breathing hadn't improved on the 13th, but still no one quite knew what was going to happen. Before we get to his final day, if you're enjoying this content and would like to get more from me, please remember to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell switched on so that YouTube knows you approve and will keep you up to date with all my content releases. I also have a Patreon page where I share bonus material, including early access to ad-free videos, mini podcasts, blog posts, and more. Finally, you can check out my Amazon storefront, where I've collected together lists of history-themed books, TV shows, movies, and more, which I think you'll like. Both are linked below for you, as is my Instagram account. Thank you too to those of you who support the channel using the thanks button underneath videos, as your generosity is very kind, always appreciated, and as with my patrons, it helps me to keep doing what I'm doing. Victoria was, quote, dreadfully anxious and nervous about his quick breathing though, and Dr. Jenner seemed to be trying to prepare her for the worst that evening, for he, quote, looked very anxious and said my beloved one was not so well, that this quick breathing might lead to congestion of the lungs. He had not remained long on the sofa. There is no doubt that Dr. Jenner is very anxious, though he hopes dear Albert will pull through. Oh, how I prayed that he might be spared to me. Sat near my darling till 8, when he was very quiet, comfortably warm, and so dear and kind, completely like himself. The other doctor, Sir James Clark, was also hopeful, but said they must give a rather unfavourable bulletin, which could of course be improved should beloved Albert go on well. The third doctor, Dr. Watson, said he had seen many infinitely worse cases recover. They were giving Albert brandy and telling Victoria he was gaining ground, with a better pulse and breathing. The final entry in Victoria's diary for that year was written on the night of the 13th, and ended with the words, Dr. Watson, as well as Mr. Brown, were going to sit up and said there was no reason to anticipate anything worse. Unfortunately, they were wrong. For a contemporary report of what happened next, we have to switch sources to an account written by Sir Howard Elphinstone, who was tutor to Prince Arthur, one of Victoria and Albert's children, and who was at Windsor on the 14th of December. He wrote that the Prince of Wales had been sent for on the night of Friday the 13th, which, quote, was the first time I had felt any alarm about the Prince Consort. He was deeply concerned the next day, and at 5 p.m. Prince Arthur was called for by the Queen to go to see his father. His tutor reported that the little boy returned, shocked. The face had so changed since he saw him last about 6 days ago. Elphinstone sensed what was coming, but couldn't believe it was happening, and tried to talk himself out of the idea. He went and stood in the corridor outside the Prince Consort's room and saw the doctors and family members coming and going. Even at this late stage, the doctors still weren't sure of what was going to happen. Hope and despair were alternatively dealt out, said Elphinstone. In fact, though, Albert had reached the end. At 10:50 p.m. on the 14th of December 1861, aged only 42 years old, he died. Years later, the Queen wrote down her recollections of that awful night, saying that she had been with him near the end, telling him in German that it was his little wife come to see him, and asking for and receiving a kiss. He was almost unconscious by that point, and she left the room for a minute and, quote, sat down on the floor in utter despair. Attempts at consolation from others only made me worse. Soon Princess Alice called her mother back, and Victoria re-entered and, quote, took his dear left hand, which was already cold, though the breathing was quite gentle, and I knelt down by him. Her older children, bar Vicky, who was married and living in Prussia, surrounded the bed with the doctors. The end now came. 2 or 3 long but perfectly gentle breaths were drawn, the hand clasping mine, and oh, it turns me sick to write it, all was over. The heavenly spirit fled to the world it was fit for, and free from the sorrows and trials of this world. I stood up, kissed his dear heavenly forehead, and called out in a bitter and agonizing cry, "Oh, my dear darling," and then dropped on my knees in mute, distracted despair, unable to utter a word or shed a tear. The Queen was picked up and helped into an adjacent room, where Elphinstone saw her lying on a sofa, and where she spoke to him, saying, "You will not desert me, you will all help me." The tutor then went into the blue room where Albert's body lay. His face calm, peaceful, he had gone without a struggle, said Elphinstone, but likewise without saying a word. The prince, he continued, always had a fixed idea that he would die of the first fever he got. It proved true, although I dare say that this presentiment might have accelerated it, as he never even tried to rally from the moment the illness occurred. About a week before, he told Princess Alice that he would die. And then, in that feeble state, recurred to him the scenes of childhood, which he wished to see again, to hear the birds twittering about the woods of Coburg, and be again in his warm-hearted home, away from the frigidity of England. Albert was buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor on the 23rd of December. Victoria and the princesses were not present, and instead Princes Bertie and Arthur led the mourning. The remains would later be moved to Frogmore, where an elaborate monument was built for him. But what had actually killed him? There was no post-mortem, and his cause of death has been pondered over for many years. Officially, it was typhoid fever, but more recently, everything from cancer to Crohn's disease to a gastrointestinal issue to TB have been suggested. The short answer is that we don't know for sure and never will. Certainly, though, Albert's inability to eat or sleep much for many weeks preceding his death will have run him down even further and hastened his demise. Victoria immediately embarked on one of the most famous mourning periods in history, and she forced her children and staff to do the same. Official mourning for a family member was, of course, very normal in this period, as was state mourning for a member of the royal family, and she and her court would absolutely have been expected to wear black. But Victoria's mourning took an extreme bent, and as she was the Queen, there was no one who could really rein her in. She dressed in black not for a year, but for the rest of her life, and while her courtiers were gradually allowed to return to colours, her ladies-in-waiting were restricted to grey, white and mauve, while the maid who was actually in attendance upon her had to stick to black. Royal servants were still wearing a black armband as late as 1869. The black edge on her mourning paper was thickened, lessening the amount of the page that could actually be used for writing, and it stayed that way. She also clung with a suffocating grip to her youngest child, Princess Beatrice, who she called the only bright spot in this dead home. On the very night Albert died, she went and took the 4-year-old out of bed, wrapped her in her dead father's clothes, and took the little girl into her own bed so that she wouldn't have to be alone. She continued to do this for a long time afterwards, and encouraged the tot to speak of Albert often. The older children weren't spared any of her eccentricities or slavish devotion to the strictures of mourning either. Princess Alice had to wear black to her own wedding the following year, which the Queen said was more like a funeral than a marriage, and Prince Bertie was held largely responsible for his father's death because of the walk in the rain the pair had gone on the 25th of November to discuss the prince's immoral behaviour. Victoria was so wrapped up in her own grief that she seems to have spared little energy to think about how difficult a time her children were having, or that her treatment of them was making things worse. The Queen also oversaw the construction of countless memorials to her husband. Some of the most famous are the Royal Albert Hall, opened in 1871 and which stands directly in front of the Albert Memorial. There were also countless statues and busts, and in Belfast we have the Albert Memorial Clock, completed in 1869 and which now leans like the Tower of Pisa. Perhaps most disturbing of all to modern eyes, although the Queen called it a living, beautiful monument, was the fact that Prince Albert's rooms were kept almost exactly as they had been. Busts and pictures of the deceased prince were added, but relatively little else was done. The rooms continued to be serviced each day as though he was still alive, with fresh clothes and a jug of hot water laid out for the use of a man who would never dress or shave again. His writing table remained in place with his pen as though he had just stepped away for a moment. His watch was kept going, his handkerchief lay on the sofa, there were fresh flowers in the rooms, and visitors to the castle had to sign his visitors' book, as though they were calling on a dead man, according to politician Benjamin Disraeli. Even the glass he'd taken his final dose of medicine from remained on the table next to the bed for over 40 years. I think we can all agree it was a deeply unhealthy environment, and such was the depth and longevity of the Queen's depression that had she not been the monarch, she might well have been institutionalised. She seems to have believed in the early days of her widowhood that it would not last long, though, expecting that she would join her husband in the grave very quickly. But in fact, despite her obvious problems with obesity and her emotional instability, she actually had a remarkably strong physical constitution, and she lived for nearly 40 years longer. It was only on the 22nd of January 1901, at the age of 81, that Victoria, by then the longest reigning monarch in English, Scottish or British history, though Elizabeth II later broke that record, finally passed away and went to be with her beloved Albert. She was buried with him too at Frogmore, with a cast of his hand in her coffin. I hope you found that discussion of Prince Albert's final days and the effect his death had on his wife and children interesting. Do check out my website, historycallingofficial.com, where you can sign up for my mailing list and receive a free download which will give you 5 quick and easy tips for spotting good and bad history books before you buy or start reading. You'll also get my newsletter, which will keep you up to date with all things History Calling, including upcoming projects. The site is linked below for you, and you can unsubscribe at any time. Let me know in the comments which part of Victoria's mourning you found the oddest. If you'd like to hear more about this famous queen and enjoy a more upbeat video, watch this documentary on her comical coronation back in 1838. Or for more royal history, try one of these options next. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.